Nokko, our 60-second Warframe, is an absolutely incredible addition to our arsenal and is insanely powerful because of how versatile and strong his base abilities are, which allows us to have some pretty diverse builds, each with their own flavor. He's able to be a high damage, high tempo caster, or a stupidly strong gun platform, or both at the same time in most cases, all while also bringing some fantastic support elements into your missions. So let's quickly go over his abilities, a quick chat about Archon Shard options, and then we'll get into my 6 different builds for him, each with different helmet options, but are all relatively similar in build crafting because of how hungry he is for both range and strength, so I'll point out any major differences between the builds or important aspects for each. Onto his abilities, his passive is just too good. When you die and have one of your mushrooms from his first or second abilities active, instead of going down and needing someone to revive you, you'll turn into your Sprawdling form for a short time. And if you make it to one of your mushrooms, you'll revive in the most JoJo pose I've ever seen and get a bonkers 8 seconds of invulnerability time, to the point that you need to change your mindset on your health and deaths while playing Nokko. Dying doesn't really matter to him as long as you have one of his shrooms down, and in fact it's a great mechanic to utilize for general survivability and one that serves as an excellent backup plan if the fighting gets tough. However, keep in mind that when you revive in this way, it'll cause all of your mushrooms from its first and second to despawn, so just make sure you put down some more right away just to be safe. If you don't have a mushroom down, then you'll just do the usual bleed out or last grasp and need reviving thing. His first ability, Stink Brain, is fairly decent, but I find myself getting pretty frustrated with one aspect of it. When it's on the ground, it'll pulse out viral damage and one status effect to all enemies in range once every 3 seconds and also put them to sleep. You can have up to 4 Stink Brains active at once, and any further casts will just replace the oldest Stink Brain. If you jump on top of them, you'll get it boosted into the air, and if you land on it, it'll send out a pulse. Personally, I'm not a big fan of the sleep mechanic, as it just kinda leads to enemies being crowd controlled and not running towards you, so I highly recommend using some kind of grouping mechanic with Nokko like a Nautilus or Cyotid, and I personally don't put down more than one of these at a time because of this sleep mechanic. This and his second ability both have synergies with his fourth, but we'll get into that in a bit. Speaking of his second, Bright Bonnet is just silly. Like Stink Brain, it'll pulse out every 3 seconds and give energy to all allies in range, including yourself of course, and also give an ability strength buff, both of which scale with strength, and the strength buff caps out at an insane 300% ability strength. You can have 2 down at a time, and while you can't double up on the strength buff aspect of it, each will give you energy each time they pulse. And just like Stink Brain, if you jump on them, they'll launch you into the air, and if you land on them, it'll activate its pulse. Unlike Stink Brain, I 100% recommend having 2 of these down at the same time for both your energy sustain as well as your squads. This is also his helmet ability, which is just great for if you need to splash in some more strength or energy sustain into your other builds. Reroot is the ability that turns into his Sprawdling, this caked up little mushroom, that makes Nokko invulnerable to damage and untargetable, and very slowly heals you over time. It'll also spawn these little orbs that he can pick up that will give him shields or overshields, health, and a bit of a speed boost. Sadly, while it's an incredibly fun ability, because you can't do anything other than run around, jump on top of your shrooms, or pick up those orbs, and with its very slow heal rate, it's not the best ability and definitely the one that we're going to be helmeting over for our builds today. And finally, Spore Spring is just bonkers. When cast, Nokko will throw out a puffball mushroom that'll bounce between enemies, terrain, and your own mushrooms, and deal a really surprising amount of toxin damage and status effects to all enemies in range, which basically makes Archon continuity an auto-include on all Nokko builds. Even better is that it can crit, and each bounce will increase its critical chance by 25% and seemingly also increase its overall damage from what I've been able to test, but I could be wrong. Meaning that in the last couple of its max 10 bounces, it can red crit and hits like a truck. Sadly, its critical damage isn't affected by things like Tenacious Bond or that new Cyanax augment, but Arcane Crepuscular's final 3 times critical multiplier does affect it, which we'll be taking advantage of in one of our builds today. I did try this with Cyto 9's Evade, but even though it often lands on people's heads, it doesn't get weak point hits. So if you're wanting to use Crepuscular, you'll need to use a Hurus or Shade to get invisibility. Going back to that synergy I mentioned with Stink Brain and Bright Bonnet, when it bounces on them, it'll automatically activate a pulse, but also supercharge them, decreasing the time between pulses from 3 seconds to 1.5, and double the damage of Stink Brain, which doesn't really matter, but it will double the amount of strength and energy that Bright Bonnet gives you. Because of that interaction, we're gonna have over 600% ability strength on some of our builds. You can have 3 Spore Springs going at once, but be careful not to recast it too early as it will despawn the oldest cast Spore Spring, thus it can't get that extra critical chance and bonus damage. Archon Shards for all of the builds are basically going to be the same, but honestly there's a lot of personal preference in here, and ultimately it isn't really going to impact you all that much if you want to change them up. My standard shard choices for all the builds today are 2 Amber Tau Forts for increasing cast speed just to make them flow a little bit better into that high tempo caster playstyle that I personally love, and 3 Emerald Tau Forts for increasing ability damage to enemies affected by corrosive, which as I mentioned in the abilities, is going to be applied through Spore Spring's toxin damage and Archon continuity. You could also of course use the Emerald Shards to increase the maximum number of corrosive stacks to get you to that magic 14 stacks needed for 100% armor removal. But honestly, I find that Spore Spring just kills things long before that point, so I'm not going to be using them on my builds, but I do recommend it as an option for one of them, especially if you're looking to do long endurance stuff into the higher enemy levels or level cap area. Another good Emerald option is the increase of toxin damage, so make sure to do a bit of testing to see which fits you. If you don't have the Emeralds, I'd just throw on some more ability strength or duration from Crimson Shards, and this is one of the few frames where the Azure Health Shards have a place in my mind because of his very low base health. But no matter what you go for, I'd recommend at least one Amber Caspide Shard just to speed up his playstyle a bit. Onto the builds, our first one is more of a shield tank build utilizing Hildren's Helmet Pillage, and is more geared towards being a weapon platform. Pillage is just one of the best options in the game for any frame that could use some more survivability through its shield generation and status cleansing, and will greatly improve your damage output with its defense removal, which Nokko isn't really going to say no to and is a great option if you don't feel like leaning on his passive for survivability. On top of that, since we have free viral being spread by Stinkbrain, we'll also be able to use that status's increased damage to health because of that defense removal. Here's the build where we're going heavily into strength and range in order to best take advantage of all of his abilities, and with Molt Augmented, Growing Power, and Bright Bonnet, we'll be well above the 400% strength needed for Pillage to 100% defense strip. As Bright Bonnet is our energy sustain, we don't really need to mod for that in any way really, just make sure that you have 2 of them down as often as you can. Our other arcane option other than Molt Augmented is certainly a flex spot, but I've gone with Aegis just to lean into that shield tanking a bit more. My second build is using Rhino's Roar. Yeah, I know, basic as heck, but honestly this could be swapped out for other weapon damage increasing helmets such as Mirage's Eclipse or Zaku's Zada's Whisper, but I've gone with Roar to increase Nokko's ability damage and that toxin proc with the whole Roar double dipping thing, as well as weapon damage, which makes this a bit more of a caster weapon platform hybrid and allows you to focus on either playstyle. Just like with the rest of our builds, we're once again focusing heavily into strength and range, with a bit more into strength with this one to really boost up Roar and Bright Bonnet, so that once Growing Power and Molt Augmented kick in, we're getting Roar to 176% bonus damage, and Bright Bonnet strength up to 214 for you and your squad. If you're having troubles with survivability or just aren't a fan of the passive, which by the way you do keep the Roar buff active when you do the passive Death Gate, which is kinda nice, I'd swap out Growing Power for Brief Respite and work with it, the Augur mod, and Rolling Guard to take advantage of shield gating, which is why we once again have Arcane Aegis in our other arcane slot, but again this is a flex spot, so swap in whatever works best for your playstyle. Next, we have what I'd say is a full caster build using Wisp Breach Surge for even more damage. Since Spore Spring deals such incredible damage and does AoE along with Stinkbrain, Breach Surge will constantly be spitting out sparks that, like Spore Spring, can crit, and thus will be taking advantage of Arcane Crepuscular for more ability strength, but more importantly, the 3x critical multiplier, which does affect both of those abilities. Since Nokko doesn't have an invisibility, we're gonna have to use either the Shade or the Hurus Kubro in order to get that invisibility so that we can get that strength and critical damage buff, which since we'll be casting the whole time anyway, we won't be breaking that invis with firing a weapon. Like with the War build, we're going hard into strength with a good chunk of range to increase the AoEs of Spore Spring and the radius of Breach Surge so that we can get those fireworks really going. And I've gone with Brief Respite here this time baseline along with the 2 Augur mods, as I've found that having that extra bit of shield generation is nice, but since invisibility is basically invincibility at most stages of the game, feel free to swap this out to Growing Power for even more strength or whatever you feel like using. Now this might be my favorite of the more weapon platform focused builds, since we're going to be using Styanax's helmet Tharros Strike and its brand new augment Tharros Lethality. This thing is insane, giving you and your squad 100% critical damage to enemies affected by it, which doubles if you're using a spear gun, and yes, it scales with strength. Since this also heals you as well as removes defenses on top of the augment, this pairs incredibly well with a wide variety of weapons, and due to that heal we'll be using Arcane Blessing to give Nokko some more health to play around with that aspect of Tharros Strike. With this build, while we're losing a bit of our strength to overextended, we'll still be keeping some pretty impressive strength values to give us as much critical damage as we can get from Tharros Lethality. Like I mentioned earlier, in that Flex Arcane slot, I'm using Arcane Blessing so that Tharros Strike has some more health to actually work with alongside Adaptation. Just make sure that your companion has Synth Deconstruct on it to ensure that you can get your health up in quick order. I do find that I tend to need to lean onto the passive every once in a while I get those health orbs, but that only really happens, if it happens at all, within the first 2 minutes of a mission, but it's just something to keep in mind. Next, we have another build that can be played either as a caster or weapon platform with Araxes Webbed Embrace or Caliban's Sentient Wrath, with his damage vulnerability boosting up his ability and weapon damage, and since both want high range and also high strength to increase its damage vulnerability, this pairs incredibly well with Nokko. Webbed Embrace also does toxin damage, thus the Archon continuity we already want to be using on Nokko is getting a bit of a double benefit there. However, if you're wanting to be more mobile with your gameplay, Caliban's Sentient Wrath is another excellent option that yields similar results with its frontal cone damage vulnerability, and of course both options will give you some additional crowd control. With this one, we're focusing more into range than some of the others so that Webbed Embrace can hit more things. And like the others, we're going heavily into strength to increase his damage, strength bonus, and increase the damage vulnerability out of Webbed Embrace or Sentient Wrath. Like most of the others, we'll be using shield gating as our primary survivability mechanic, so feel free to swap out Growing Power for Brief Respite if you feel that you need that extra shield generation, and I've also tested it out and had a ton of fun doing that by putting in catalyzing shields and threw on some auger mods onto my pistol, which if I'm being honest does have better survivability and will do much better into long endurance runs and is basically the same as our next build, but with the passive being what it is, I personally don't really care all that much if I die, but there's the option for you. And finally, we have our last build, which I tend to play more as a caster, where I'm using Korra's Ensnare to group enemies together so that Spore Spring can really rapidly bounce between and dispatch enemies in quick order. Since Spore Spring will deal AoE on each enemy it bounces on, or of course your own mushrooms, when they're this grouped up, it really starts to red crit quickly with that increased critical chance based on the number of bounces, and will wipe out whole crowds of baddies super fast. This build is, like I said, basically the alternative build that I quickly mentioned in the Araxi or Caliban Helmet option, where I use shield gating for my overall survivability with Rolling Guard, Brief Respite, Augur Reach, and Catalyzing Shields. And just like the rest, we have high range for all of his abilities and Ensnare's grouping. And of course, high strength really helps Spore Spring dish out the damage. And because we've got enemies so well grouped, if you're looking to do more endgame endurance or level cap oriented missions, you may want to get some of those +2 max corrosive shards onto here to give you some additional armor strip, especially when you throw out more than one Spore Spring. The grouped enemies will get their armor reduced super quickly from the AoE toxin, thus corrosive through Archon continuity, thus increasing you and your squad's damage that much more. And there we have it, 6 different builds that are all relatively similar to each other in mods, but each have their own twist and enjoyable playstyle that allows you to enjoy Nokko in nearly whatever way that you want to. As always, and like you should with all creator builds, make sure to take these as an inspiration to make something cool yourself. Let me know in the comments how you enjoy using Nokko, and as always, sub for more tips and swing by my stream if you need any help.